hello to everybody. For those of you who have not taken one of my courses in the past, my name is Nick Davies. I'm a clarinetist and a composer. Um, I live in Indianapolis year round, but I grew up for a time on Nantucket, and so I have connection to the music center where I first was learning cello with Molly Glazer, voice with Greta Feeney, and clarinet with Joël Bouchard. And now I freelance here in Indianapolis and in LA, and one of my great passions is aside from composing and playing, is talking about music, and especially opera, and in addition, and sometimes there's obviously overlap, music of the 20th and 21st century. So this is our first class today on a series that we'll be giving for the rest of this year on femme fatales of opera. First of all, before I continue and before we get to Puccini, I'd like to thank first of all NCMC for hosting this class, for inviting me to do these lectures, to our donors for making it possible. And I should also mention that these classes are in part given in memory of Andy Bullington. And so shall we get to it? Let's see if I can actually, there we go. So I said before that I am particularly interested in talking about opera. And of course the question there raises, why opera? Why am I particularly interested in opera? And for me, it's a great way actually to introduce people to classical music. And for people who maybe already are fans of classical music, to deepen their understanding of the music. Now, that's because opera, in a certain way, gives words, right, to feelings that are unexpressed in music. That's the interesting thing about Western classical music, and about really, I suppose, all music, is that it expresses the inexpressible. And what's interesting sometimes is, let's say you take your favorite aria by Mozart or Puccini, or you name it, and you take away the words and you make it an entirely instrumental piece. It's an interesting exercise in, hey, does this music convey what the words are intending to do? What does it make you feel? What does it express to you? What does La Ciderem la mano from Don Giovanni, what does this flirtatious aria or duet rather suggest to you as a listener without the words, without knowing what it means? And I think it's a great way of parsing out Mozart when he's writing a string quartet, let's say. And let's say we are aware of Don Giovanni, we are aware of Notti di Figaro, we're aware of Così fan tutte, we're aware of these three big operas that he's written. And then when we go and listen to a string quartet, we say, I hear that opera buffa, these sort of comic characters, or the death aria, or whatever it is that you hear in an opera in the instrumental music. It's sort of a gateway for understanding the rhetoric and the syntax and the language itself, because it puts to words the feelings, or rather the feelings to words, or it kind of goes both ways. It's the funny thing about it. In addition, it also it's a great way of understanding the inner psychology of the composer. What topics is he interested? Mozart, going back to that example, he's often interested in the ways that the upper class are sort of defrocked, or made fun of, or sort of made buffoons of. Whereas Puccini is interested in these sort of very realistic characters that we can connect with in a personal way. These love stories that are tearjerkers, right? And it also, again, gets us into the philosophy, the musical philosophy that they're working with. What are they trying to express, and in what kind of mentality or intellectual sphere are they working from? Not only that, but much like anything else, opera, because it is so intrinsically linked to drama, helps us understand how art changes. And as somebody who has a vested interest in sort of saying, what's the meaning of a piece that I don't understand, be it from the Baroque to the modern era, understanding how art changes and what it's supposed to do, or what it ideally does, or what it winds up doing, are all key questions we ask ourselves when we are trying to understand it. And the idea of femme fatales, there's a couple of reasons. I mean, why it interests me and why I think it interests people in general. I mean, it's sort of it's hard to get away from the clear elephant in the room, which is that they're just, it's fun to gossip, right? That's sort of the whole, that's kind of the underpinning of enjoying talking about these sort of risque and scandalous characters. It's just, it's part of our sociological DNA. But it also is an interesting study in how we view and have treated women in our dramatic works, in our culture throughout, the period that opera has existed, so 1600 to today. Opera, I should mention, is one of the defining features of the Baroque era, which was the first known opera was written in 1597, which we'll get to in a second. But it's interesting to see how, when we look at Monteverdi's Poppaea, how that depiction is completely different from almost 300 years later with Manon Lescaut in Puccini. And it's a great way of cataloging that change, that societal change, and again, the way that these characters are depicted. It's just sort of a fascinating case study for each of these. So it's hard to emphasize how important opera is to the Italians, especially in this late Romantic period of around 1875 to 1900. As I mentioned, opera was first started in around 1597. It was an attempt to recreate Greek tragedy as it was told in the classical literature. And it was sort of this strict small societies in Italy where they were sort of trying to recreate these dramas. So there are typically classical subjects, Orpheus by Monteverdi, or histories like the coronation of Poppaea. So the very first one was Daphne by Jacopo Peri, and kind of how ballet is an intrinsically French art form, opera is intrinsically Italian. But what's interesting about Italian music, generally speaking, is that it's sort of always been at the forefront of high art. Bach copied the music of Vivaldi. Literally, he would transcribe it, and he it's sort of as a means to learn from it, and modeled his concertos after this Italian form. Haydn, his symphonies and his quartets are modeled after Sammartini. Handel imitated Italian opera in his own Italian operas. Handel, being a German composer living in England, writing Italian opera. But sort of paradoxically, Italy may also, by the same stroke, by the opinions of many, and may not have had necessarily the best composers. So instead, there's sort of these exemplars of style and form. Corelli, another great example, the father of the trio sonata, which would have been even further perfected by composers like Telemann or Bach or Couperin or Rameau, so on and so forth. What wound up happening is that by the time we hit the Romantic era, there is this huge focus on opera. We have these giants of Rossini, Donizetti, Cherubini, who were writing what is known as bel canto opera, which simply means well sung. And bel canto opera it's an incredibly florid type of music that is interested in beauty of tone, legato or smooth phrasing, and this incredibly skillful soprano coloratura singing. A great example of sort of a precursor to this bel canto style would have been the Queen of the Night's aria from Mozart's Magic Flute. But this style towards the end of the century was best exemplified in Giuseppe Verdi, who wrote operas including Rigoletto, La Traviata, Falstaff, Macbeth. It goes on, so on and so forth. But by the time we get to this era, it's kind of viewed as a stagnant art form. Italy was sort of idling artistically. But before we continue to the other options that were available in this stagnant landscape, let's give a listen to a little bit of this bel canto style. So first we have Caro Nome from Rigoletto, Act 1. This is the first chance that we have to hear the coloratura soprano sing her first big aria in the opera. It is an expression of sort of youthful love and the feelings as she is first sort of gaining independence. And what you're going to hear in particular is these sort of simple, enjoyable melodies that are marked by incredible flexibility of tone, of voice, of these, I guess, acrobatic techniques. So this is the first example of this is a classic example of this kind of bel canto music. So going over to France, we have something called grand opera, and this is exemplified by Giacomo Meyerbeer, who's a German composer of Jewish descent, which is notable because of the degree of ire that he received on account of his ethnicity, and he was, along with Mozart and Beethoven, one of the single most performed composers of the 19th century, point blank. His operas are not as popular nowadays for a variety of reasons, but one of them being that grand opera is exactly that. It is grand. It calls for enormous casts of huge ensembles, soloists, chorus, large set numbers. It's all about spectacle. It calls for sort of these complicated designs in terms of the staging. And it was also typically in sort of these, again, large scale 5-act forms. And typically, two other things were part of this French grand opera, namely that it would be about a historical subject. So, for example, the Verdi Rigoletto, it's a fictional story. But in grand opera, usually it's a historical subject. So, for instance, the opera that we'll be showing, I'll show you in a second, is Les Huguenots, about the slaughtering and persecution of the Huguenots, the religious subsect in France. And the other thing about not Meyerbeer, but grand opera, is that it typically contains ballet, which is a relic of the Baroque era, of a French Baroque opera, which would by de facto include ballet. So there's this ballet opera element here. So this selection from Act 5 of Les Huguenots is the section where the two leads have declared their love for one another. They are married, and they have decided to not abandon their faith because they are opposing opposing religious sects, and he has decided, the hero has decided that he is going to remain with his faith. She sort of converts, so to speak, for him, and they die together, shot by her own people in the church. And what we hear in the background is, while this sort of stillness of their wedding in the church is happening, outside, the Huguenots are being shot, and you hear them coming sort of closer and closer as they sing hymns in defiance of the oppressors. So this very sort of almost over the top. Sometimes this kind of these types of opera, this French grand opera, can seem a little bit campy by certain standards, but it's incredibly dramatic and incredibly over the top. And of course, the final type of opera here that is essential is Richard Wagner's sort of complete works. Here I have written Opera und Drama, not 1951, but 1851. He published this particular treatise, or rather, not even a treatise. It's more kind of like a rant in certain ways, but it's a I guess a credo for the way that he saw music and art, and the sort of Gesamtkunstwerk, the complete work of art that I've talked about before in some of our other classes, about the music being the uniting force of all arts to create sort of a higher art, a higher civilization, music of the future, and there are a number of components to Wagner's work, especially in the way that he treats his musical materials that we'll get into. For instance, he introduces something called leitmotivic structure. A leitmotif is simply a musical idea, a melody, a chord, or a gesture that is associated very specifically with a character, an idea, a place. And the way that Wagner writes these leitmotifs into his opera is all sort of woven together to create this meta structure where the musical narrative that is happening in the orchestra reflects the inner feelings and happenings of the characters. Another thing that is notable about Wagner is this characteristic of endless melody, because what exists in Meyerbeer and in Verdi and in the bel canto opera, in grand opera, is something. The structure is called number opera, and it's called number opera because each of the sections of the work can be sort of clearly packaged into. This is, right here is going to be the aria, followed by the recitative, followed by the scene, followed by another duet, followed by another recitative. In Mozart, and in Baroque opera, this is even more clearly defined. You'd have the recitative, which is sung entirely over what would have been harpsichord or forte piano accompaniment, followed by an orchestral aria. So each of all the action occurs in the recitative, and all the thoughts and feelings of the characters happens in the orchestrally treated arias, duets, terzetos, so on and so forth. And Wagner takes this idea of these sort of compartmentalized sections of an opera, and he tosses it completely out the window. And what is in its place is this sort of seamless orchestral texture where the drama sort of unfolds. And the criticism levied at him by his detractors, especially from these two other schools, is that it sort of eliminates melody. It turns these bel canto arias, or these sort of melody-driven lines into almost a declamation. It's almost like they're just saying words on stage. rather than singing a beautiful melody. And that's of course by design. The orchestra itself becomes a much more important part of the operatic texture. It becomes a character in essence of the work. And what's interesting about the way that the impact that Wagner had is that different factions chose to take different parts of his musical philosophy and adapt it for their own usage. So I'm going to show you an excerpt from the Liebesnacht, the love night scene from Tristan und Isolde, which again, this is a great example of endless melody. You'll hear the same motivic fragment, the same musical fragment repeated again and again and again, each time translated into a new key every single time, sort of heightening and moving the drama up just a little bit of a notch. So, in particular, what's notable about the subject here, too, of course, is that this opera, Tristan und Isolde, is about forbidden love. It is about these two characters, Tristan, who is a knight. It's sort of set in on sort of an Arthurian legend manner, mythological, which is important to Wagner. Who is betraying his king by falling in love with his bride to be, the stolen Isolde, and the two drink a love potion, and the whole drama unfolds essentially because they are unable to be together, and the only way that they are able to be together is in death, which this scene sort of foreshadows. And there's the biggest thing that is notable about the subject choice, or rather the way the subject treatment, is that it's a lot more philosophical in nature. It's a lot more existential, sort of about transfiguration, about very different from the sort of historical or verismo, realism subjects that we see in the other operas. So one thing that a lot of these Italian composers took, including Puccini, from this era, is that even though they may not have liked Wagner's philosophy, they found it maybe too heavy. They loved the orchestral writing, and they loved the sort of approach to the orchestra, the way that the textures worked, the way that there's this seamless drama. So let's talk a little bit about Puccini. So Puccini was born in Lucca, in Italy, in 1858. He was part of a long-standing musical dynasty since the early 1700s. I think it's his great, maybe an extra great grandfather was named also Giacomo. And they were all known for writing church music, liturgical music, masses, so on and so forth. And his father actually died, another composer, died when he was quite young, when he was only 6. But he wound up studying at the Milan Conservatory, where he studied with one of these bel canto composers, Amilcare Ponchielli, who is best known for his opera The Hours, La Gioconda, which still it's not performed terribly often today, but many of you probably actually know the most famous number from it, from the you're all going to remember the man who did the spoof, but the one who Hello Mother, Hello Father, Here I Am at Camp Granada. That tune is by Ponchielli. Anyway, now that I've admitted my flaw there for not knowing that, we'll keep on talking about Puccini. So yes, so he has 2 early successes. This Mass from 1880 and this Capriccio Sinfonico from 1883. Now notice, neither of these are operas. He was not originally inclined that direction, but after his success with Levili in 1883, he was sort of encouraged by this, in spite of the fact that I think it came last place in this Sonzogno competition. And the following opera that he wrote was kind of was a bit of a flop. But then when he wrote Manon Lescaut, he started taking things to a new direction for Italian opera. Le Villi was one of these number operas written more in the bel canto style. Manon Lescaut was an authentically original product in many ways. It was truly something new in the way that it combined elements of both Verdi and Wagner in this new way. And he became essentially this Italian successor to Verdi with his most famous operas, La Bohème, Tosca, Madama Butterfly. And many of you may know him through just his incredible melodic writing. He was had these sort of lush orchestral textures and this incredible harmonic language. Now, the work upon which Manon is based is a book by the Abbé Prévost, who is a late Baroque era author from Hesdin in France. He was also a Jesuit and had experience in the military. He ran away, as a matter of fact, in part because of an affair that he was having, which sort of ties into the autobiographical aspects of this book. Now, the book itself, Histoire du Chevalier de Grue et de Manon Lescaut, is the 7th volume of a large collection called The Memoirs and Adventures of a Man of Quality. This is his sort of large scale, sprawling serial novel. It's kind of a little bit of a picaresque characteristic to it. And the book, as I mentioned, is also semi autobiographical, and was actually initially banned in France at its publication. And what is notable about Manon is the sort of plastic or passive, pliable character that she is. She adapts to be what others want her to be, and this is the sort of that's the kind of femme fatale that she is, and this is actually a common characteristic of a lot of these femme fatale characters. The basic plot of the book, which is adapted differently by Puccini and by other composers who have set the opera to the story to an opera, is that Manon is a woman of some privilege who is being sent to a convent, and until she meets Des, who they fall in love, and he convinces her to run off with him to Paris. They run out of money, and she winds up becoming a kept woman with this man named Geronte. And finally, after some months pass, they re-meet Des and Manon. They fall in love, and as they are leaving this mansion, she is captured because she's trying to steal from Geronte. And she is sentenced to be sent off to the colonies in Louisiana, to New Orleans, where because Des wants to be with her, he bribes the crew of the ship, and they set sail off to New Orleans, where she dies of starvation in the confusingly written "The Deserts of New Orleans." So, but that's more or less the plot. It's not sort of famously, as we'll cover, it's not the world's best libretto. And there's a couple of reasons for that. But interestingly, as I mentioned a second ago, this is not the first Manon to be written. In fact, Jules Massenet also wrote a Manon. This one, Puccini's is the full Manon Lescaut. Massenet's is simply Manon. And this particular opera was written only 8 years prior, in 1884, and this work is actually still part of the standard operatic repertoire. And Massenet was another one of these preeminent composers of grand opera, much like Meyerbeer, just a later one. And the other aspect of this is that this particular opera is actually not grand opera, but opera comique, which is not just simply comic opera. It's not just humorous. It's a little bit more complicated than that. It originated in the early 18th century with humorous and satirical plays, but usually what it actually means is opera that also contains spoken word. This opera in particular does actually contain elements of comedy, which Puccini's does not. It's much more eclectic. It contains ballet, and it's much more about faith versus love, because one of the scenes that Puccini chooses to cut from the original novel is that there is a scene in which Des has chosen to join a church and become a monk, and he is convinced out of it by Manon. another thing that Massenet's opera chooses to do, for instance, is that instead of going all the way to New Orleans, instead Manon dies in internment in Le Havre just before she's about to leave. So it's interesting to see the way that these different composers challenge, or rather deal with the challenge of this incredibly long book. Of course, you know, with all opera, you have to really compact things. In this opera, Massenet chooses to set it in a 6 highly constructed scenes that tell sort of a clear narrative from start to end. And as Puccini critiques it, perhaps a little unfairly, he termed it being all powder and minuets, which is funny because the second act of Puccini's opera itself is a Baroque set piece of powder and minuets. So this gets to what Puccini wanted to do in his version of Manon. There's an emphasis on what he called the desperate passion of Manon Lescaut. It's much more about the tragedy and about the verismo, the realistic depiction of these characters. Much like I've been saying, it's Puccini's treatment is much more coloristic. It's much more the orchestra is an integral part of the drama, the way that a Wagner opera would be. And he, instead of constructing in these sort of narrative start to finish scenes, it is more like 4 acts or 4 tableaux, scenes from the life of Manon Lescaut rather than the complete picture. It's much more disjunct. It's an illustration of a world. That's the best way to put it. So here's a little excerpt from the seduction scene from Massenet's Manon, where Manon convinces Des Grieux to leave the church that he is hiding out in. So again, you kind of see some of these characteristics even of grand opera in the as we saw in Meyerbeer, these sort of different effects, the style of vocal writing. It's all very interconnected. So unlike Massenet's version, we have sort of a couple of interesting aspects to Puccini's opera. Now, first of all, I mentioned before that the libretto for Puccini's Manon is infamously uneven. One might even go so far as to say bad. This is because there were just so many people who put work into putting it to this. There's Marco Praca, Giuseppe Giacosa, Luigi Illica, Puccini, and there's about a dozen others. It's ridiculous. No one really knew quite even who to attribute it to, when they first premiered it. Giacosa and Illica would go on to work with Puccini more on much better librettos for much more well-known operas. But it's something to bear in mind when we look at this, that Puccini really had to rely on the value of his own music, communicating what the feelings and the emotions and the story of the music is, which we'll come into later. This is, again, that thing that we were talking about at the beginning about the difference between the feelings of the sort of the emotions of the music versus the emotion of the words, versus whether or not the music communicates what the words intend to say, even if you don't know the words. Our cast of characters. We have Manon Lescaut. Lescaut, her brother, who is sort of this interesting, morally ambiguous person who kind of lets her do whatever she wants, but is also kind of a guardian angel. We have Des, who is a student, who, of course, is the hero of the story, who falls in love with Manon. There's Geronte de Revoir, who is an elderly, a rich man who also spies Manon and is sort of her lover for what most of Act 2, basically bankrolling her existence in Paris after they run out of money, Manon and Desrieux. Then there's also Edmondo, who plays a minor but large role at the very beginning of the opera. He sort of sets the stage. He is a friend and fellow student of Desrieux. So again, other than this very standard romantic orchestra complement, double winds, so 2 flutes and piccolo, 2 oboes, 2 clarinets, 2 bassoons, standard brass, strings, harp, etc. And as I mentioned, it is no longer a number opera, so it has nothing. It has nothing in common with his earlier opera Le Villi, and has much more in common structurally with a Wagner opera. So, because of the fact that it is so reliant on its music and not its libretto, it is a character opera. It is emphasizing the emotional and experiences of the characters and depictions of the characters themselves. So here we have the opera winds up being this interesting kind of symphonic approach to music. To opera rather, which is the Wagner way of doing things, but it's also influenced by Verdi's Aida from 1871, which contains some of these Wagnerian elements that Puccini went to go see this in 1876. As I've also mentioned, this continuous texture, these leitmotifs, are all part of this new Italian opera texture that takes Wagner's approach and fuses it seamlessly with Verdi. Um, he also introduces these lengthy orchestral interludes. The intermezzo from Manon Lescaut is actually performed as an individual concert piece. This is something that he also took from Wagner. And it's interesting, he has these very lengthy plot-based inscriptions in the score that depict what's going on. It's not very helpful as an audience member for something to be like that to be written in the score, but it does, again, it tells the music is trying to paint a story that is going on, even if we don't understand fully what's going on. And what Puccini used this opera as a sort of an opportunity for him to showcase the best of his stuff that he'd written to that date. So he picked a whole bunch of his pre-existing works to go into this opera, which is interesting because what it means is that the music that he had written, he felt accurately depicted what was going on in the opera. And let's go on with a couple of examples. So there's first this chrysanthemums for string quartet that he puts in the act 3 and 4 of the opera. Chrysanthemi was written as an elegy to Amadeo di Savoia, the Duke of Aosta, who had passed away, and he wrote this elegy overnight for this Duke. And what he recycles this music then for later would be for the death of Manon Lescaut. So let's hear the comparison of the two musics. Let's hear the Chrysanthemi, and then we'll listen to the Act 4 excerpt. So you hear these very richly chromatic, almost, but not actually, sort of Wagnerian harmonies. And this is what it sounds like when he puts it into the opera. So it's interesting. It's almost like he's writing their elegy into their experience. Another interesting transformation is of these three minuets in Acts 1 and 2. What it is essentially he wrote these three minuets for three of his friends, or rather four of his friends, and this is sort of delightful, playful music that harkens back to a different time, and it reflects in turn the beginning of the opera, which is full of optimism and of these friends, speaking, reciting love poems, so on and so forth. And it's very lively, and he adds all sorts of orchestral colors to heighten that effect from the string quartet version. Not only that, but he actually increases the tempo too, so it's faster, it's more sprightly. So here's the version for string quartet. And this is what it sounds like in the overture. So this style of writing of opera is particularly unique to Puccini, and it sort of marks, along with works like Maschiani's Cavalleria Rusticana, this Verismo movement. It is this idea of realism in art, music, and literature that shifts the dramatic emphasis towards, obstacles that are external or self-induced, rather than, for instance, these sort of love being necessarily the actual obstacle. It's sort of these almost not quite. I guess it's a shift away from maybe thinking about things in terms of fate, in terms of God, in terms of mythology. It's more towards this everyday character. And not only that, but it starts to sort of question morality. It begins to take on these questions of what, how do we quantify good and evil in an opera like Manon Lescaut, where the characters are just victims of circumstance. And furthermore, it is a full integration of the drama and the music, much the way that Wagner was a proponent of. These seamless orchestral acts of sort of I guess going back to that idea of endless melody. Whereas, of course, in something like Verdi, it's much more about the life and death choices, the family versus love, love being the thing that causes destruction. Instead, it has this sort of pathetic melancholy that exists in it. And Manon, in many ways, is much like the Mascagni, a movement towards the future of what Italian opera would become. And another thing that's interesting here is that Manon essentially becomes Puccini's first heroine. He's very famous for his female characters. And one thing that's interesting about her, again, her as a femme fatale, is that she is passive. She just adapts musically and dramatically to the situation that she's in. She follows the music of Des Grieux at the beginning. She turns the second act into a highly organized musically set piece of Baroque objects, of these minuets that he was criticizing, of these madrigals, of these sort of stately things. And the one thing that she potentially, the one thing that she did wrong is that she was greedy. That's sort of is her flaw, is that the reason that she and Des Grieux don't escape at the end of Act 2 is that she chooses the jewels that she wants over leaving. But in spite of this passivity, there is no, or maybe because of that, there is no redemption for her. There is nothing but bad luck and excessive punishment. I mean, being sent off to the colonies for stealing it's ridiculous by modern standards, but it's interesting. It instead catalogs her amoral self and her moral degradation, and the way that affects the people around her. Des Grieux, for instance, as somebody who follows. And we see that reflected musically, because what happens is that throughout the opera, there's a degradation of form. This Act 2, it's extremely formalized and clear. By Act 3, we don't hear clear cadences. It's almost like the music is not quite reaching the end of a sentence. And by the time we get to Act 4, there's a complete lack of form. It's sort of just a half hour of this extended death scene. And in a certain way, it mimics the abandonment of civilization that they have wound up in, and it's almost akin to the Liebestod from Tristan. It's almost it has sort of a parallel relationship to the way that these extended death scenes of distilling a character down to their essence it was sort of innovated by Wagner. So on that note, that more or less concludes what our little segment here on Manon. It's a funny little opera. It's almost more the beginning of something new, as much as it is a reflection of the circumstances that Puccini is in. But Manon, in certain ways, inspires Puccini to start this new, to begin this new era of Italian opera, and really a new cultural movement altogether. So if there are any questions at this point in time, let me know. I'm always happy to talk about anything we've gone over. Thank you all very much for being here. As always, it's a pleasure, and I will send the recording of the opera for all of you to listen to if you should wish. Oh, I have a Q&A. Yes, thank you. Yep, Alan Sherman. Yep, there we go. Thank you. Thank you. I knew it was at the back of my head. Thank you. Yes, that's Ponchielli. But yes. Feel free to email me if you have any questions, but in the meantime, have a great evening, and I'll look forward to seeing you next time.